Elliot Walters first noticed something was off about his neighbor on a humid, moonless night. He had been standing at his bedroom window, trying to lure in some fresh air through the crack in the glass. It was nearly midnight, and the small suburban cul-de-sac slept soundlessly, except for one person. Across the silent street, the man who had recently moved in next door paced on his porch under the flickering light of an old lamp. Elliot couldn't remember the neighbor's name, some unusual surname he was too shy to pronounce, but he knew the man was some kind of historian, or maybe a librarian. He was tall and lanky, with unervingly sharp facial features. Something about him repelled conversation, so Elliot had always kept a polite distance. Now, as he watched from behind the curtains, that feeling of unease intensified. There was a rhythm to the neighbor's stride, a mechanical repetitiveness, as if he was counting each step. Elliot's curiosity piqued. He switched off the bedside lamp, hoping the darkness would let him observe without being seen. Through the gloom, the neighbor suddenly stopped and tilted his head, as if listening to a faint whisper only he could hear. Then, with a bizarre and fluid motion, he seemed to pull something from his coat pocket, a small object that glinted dully under the light. A strange sensation needled at Elliot's consciousness, a primal warning telling him he shouldn't be watching. The neighbor's eyes flicked around, scanning the shadows as though he sensed an intruder's gaze. Elliot ducked, heart racing, and waited. For a tense moment, the neighbor's gaze hovered on Elliot's window. But eventually, the man resumed his mysterious pacing, muttering under his breath in a low, slithering voice that Elliot couldn't quite make out. An unsettling feeling lingered even after the neighbor retreated inside. Elliot stared out his window at the empty porch, mind whirling. He wanted to believe it was nothing, a trick of the light, or an overactive imagination, but doubt nagged at him. Something was horribly wrong with the man across the street, and Elliot had no idea that the strange pacing was only the beginning of a dark and harrowing nightmare he could never have foreseen. That night, Elliot slept soundly, but was haunted by a dream of dilapidated figures crawling across the neighbor's porch. In his dream, the man's footsteps turned into a frantic dance, each step reverberating through the neighborhood until the ground began to crack. When Elliot finally woke up at dawn, his sheets were soaked with sweat. Trying to shake off his lingering anxiety, Elliot headed to the kitchen and turned on the radio. There was interference from the speakers before the local news came on. Police investigating the disappearance of? Elliot turned the dial, but the broadcast dissolved into more static. He cursed quietly under his breath. Lately, electricity had been coming and going, leaving signals scrambled. When he went outside to get the newspaper, that oppressive feeling returned. The neighbor's house seemed eerily quiet, with the curtains drawn, despite the fact that the sun was creeping out from behind the horizon. The porch lamp was still on, hissing and blinking against the daylight. A cool breeze rustled in the morning air. Glancing quickly around the yard, Elliot noticed something strange on the wet grass. Footprints, elongated and irregularly shaped, as if someone had slipped in shoes too big for a human foot. They led from the neighbor's porch across the yard and suddenly ended, disappearing into the sidewalk as if swallowed up by concrete. He crouched down to look at them, but a surge of nausea twisted his stomach. He felt a sudden headache, and every pulse behind his eyes seemed to whisper, "Don't look too closely." Swallowing hard, he returned to his house, slamming the door harder than usual. That day, an uneasy silence seemed to envelop the entire neighborhood. There were no children playing in the streets, no cars rumbling. Even the familiar barking of the neighbor's dog, an animal Elliot had noticed when he first moved in, was strangely absent. By mid-afternoon, Elliot began to feel claustrophobic. In need of some fresh air and a dose of normalcy, he plucked up the courage to cross the street and knock on his neighbor's door. He knocked 3 times, and each knock was unnaturally loud in the quiet cul-de-sac. When the door finally opened, a tall historian appeared on the threshold, with bulging eyes and a stale smell of incense. The corridor behind him was dim, and what a frightened Elliot could make out looked messy and irregular, as if every piece of furniture had been dragged to a new, illogical place. A faint scraping sound echoed somewhere deep inside, but the man made no move to explain it. "Can I help you?" The neighbor asked in a voice so low that Elliot was forced to lean forward. For a moment, Elliot lost his nerve. He tried to come up with some polite excuse, asking for sugar or a lost letter, but the words stuck in his throat. Suddenly, the light in the hallway flashed on, illuminating something dark and splattered on the edge of the carpet. Elliot's breath caught in his throat as he realized it was a rust-colored stain that was disappearing from view. The historian's gaze followed Elliot's eyes. Slowly, the man stepped forward, his posture radiating an unspoken warning. Elliot felt a cold sweat break out on his back, every nerve screaming for him to leave immediately. He stammered out a hasty apology, turned around, and without another word, fled into the midday glow. Back in his own home, Elliot slammed the door and let his heart pound in his chest. For a few shaky breaths, he tried to convince himself that his neighbor had simply failed to do his job, that it was just a simple spill. But deep down, he knew he had stumbled upon something terrible, something that pulsed with a dark undercurrent that he could almost feel on the tip of his tongue. And now that he saw it, there was no turning back. In the days that followed, Elliot was consumed by an all-consuming obsession with the neighbor's secret. Sleep became a fragile commodity, and he woke up every night to ghostly sounds, a soft scratching on the window or a distant knock from across the street. His dreams were haunted by blurry figures convulsing and twisting under the flickering lantern of a neighbor's porch, their outlines punctuated by what looked like ancient runic marks. The tension grew with each passing hour. Even simple tasks seemed dangerous. Several times Elliot thought he saw a neighbor standing in his own window looking directly at Elliot's house. Worse, he saw something else in that window, a huge shadowy outline that moved behind the neighbor with a slow, hungry deliberation. Every time Elliot blinked, the figure disappeared. But the fear it left in its wake took root in his insides like poison. Desperate to understand what was happening, Elliot decided to visit the local archive. He wanted to find out more about the man next door, anything that could explain the strange footprints, the flickering light, the rancid smell that stuck to him, which smelled like old incense and rotten wood. Under the flickering fluorescent lights, Elliot looked through moldy documents and old papers. The staff seemed reluctant to help. One of them turned pale when Elliot mentioned his neighbor's name. In a dusty corner of the archive, Elliot found a battered folder containing a handful of archaic documents. They detailed a scandal from almost a century ago, a family rumored to have practiced forbidden rites on the outskirts of town. Their last known descendant had disappeared without a trace. Some said he was wandering the country. Others whispered of unspeakable rituals. Now the missing man's name was the same as his neighbor's. Elliot felt a cold horror prickle his skin. The note, written in a fragmentary handwriting, referred to abominable practices of conjuring the invisible. It was accompanied by a scribbled footnote. They called him the bullfighter. Elliot's heart was pounding in his chest. He tried to read on, but the pages suddenly came to an end. When he left the archive, he fought the feeling of dizziness, the one that was leaving. He couldn't shake the image of those huge footprints in the neighbor's yard and the terrifying figure lurking in the window. That name echoed in his thoughts, twisting them into nightmarish knots. He drove home shivering, painfully aware that a malevolent force had made its lair right next door and that it was somehow beginning to notice him, too. For 3 days and nights, Elliot teetered on the edge of paranoia. Every small sound in his house, the click of the radiator at dawn, the rustling of tree branches scraping against the roof, seemed to be amplified by his growing fear. He thought about calling the police, but hesitated. He had no concrete evidence of wrongdoing, and the details he had were so bizarre that he feared he would be dismissed as a lunatic. Yet his every instinct screamed that he was in mortal danger. Late at night, Elliot began to hear unearthly sounds coming from the house next door. Not the usual nighttime hum of refrigerators or the muffled sounds of the TV, but a low, pulsating moan that would rise and fall like a distorted lullaby. Sometimes it was a sharp, rhythmic tapping, as if someone was tapping on the walls in a complex pattern. Sometimes it was softer, a hissing whisper that made Elliot break out in a cold sweat, and the words were inaudible but imbued with menace. On the 4th evening after his visit to the archive, Elliot decided that he could no longer stand the uncertainty. Darkness had fallen over the cul-de-sac, and the light of the street lamps barely penetrated the thick gloom that seemed to hang over the neighboring house. The lantern on the porch across the street flickered erratically, casting twisted shadows on the walls. For reasons Elliot couldn't explain, the house itself seemed to be breathing, expanding and contracting in the dim light. Summoning all his courage, Elliot ventured outside with a flashlight. The sky was moonless, and the air was heavy with humidity. He moved slowly through the yard, stopping every time the flashlight beam crossed a patch of lawn or sidewalk. His mouth was painfully dry, and every step echoed in his ears as if amplified by some invisible amplifier. He reached the neighbor's lawn and froze. Since he had first seen the footprints, they had grown larger. They now formed a labyrinthine path around the house, almost ritualistic in their arrangement. Some of them were larger than before, more clearly defined in the soil, with elongated toes that curved in ways no human foot could ever curve. Others overlapped, as if something multi-legged were scurrying about the site. The flashlight flickered, threatening to go out, and he struck it lightly with the palm of his hand. Then he heard a sound, quiet at first, and then more and more intense. An eerie guttural singing coming from the walls of the neighboring house, accompanied by a fluttering pulse that Elliot could feel in his bones. Though muffled, the syllables carried the weight of an ancient anger. He couldn't decipher the language, if it was language at all. Each guttural phrase seemed to warp the air, buzzing with a resonance that made the hairs on his neck prickle. Frightened, but unable to tear himself away, Elliot forced himself to get closer. Through a crack in the lowered curtains, he saw the light from a candle. Shadows wriggled in slow, serpentine dances on the far walls. He saw the silhouette of a neighbor with long arms raised in the air, as if in supplication to something beyond his sight. Then a second figure came into view, too tall, its proportions elongated and nightmarish, as if it were stretched like a toffee. Its head reached almost to the ceiling, and it seemed to lean toward its neighbor in an almost polite gesture. Elliot was seized with a suffocating sense of panic. This is it, he thought. This is the one who is coming. He remembered the documents, the warnings scribbled in frantic handwriting, and the unholy assumption that something terrible had been conjured all those decades ago. Now it was in the house next door, plunged into a hideous darkness that defied comprehension. Suddenly the singing stopped. The second figure turned its head toward the window, as if sensing Elliot's presence. Frightened, Elliot turned off the flashlight and retreated back into the shadows of the lawn, pressing against the wall of the house to avoid being seen. A cold wind blew past him, carrying the faint smell of decay. He waited there, his heart pounding, until he finally mustered the courage to slip back into his own driveway. Once inside, he locked every deadbolt he had. As he leaned against the door, the silence in the living room seemed deafening, like the calm before a storm of unimaginable horror. At that moment, Elliot realized that there was no escape from this darkness. It had seeped into his world, and now he was part of it. The only question was how much time he had before the bullfighter or his neighbor knocked on his own door. A tension like static electricity filled the air the next evening. Elliot spent the day locked in his house, pacing between the windows like a caged animal. The image of that towering figure constantly ran through his mind, as it turned to peer into the darkness with an intelligence far beyond mortal comprehension. He thought about running away until he could find some remote motel where the monster's footprints wouldn't haunt his dreams. But some dark passion would not let him go. "I have to know," he repeated, as if knowledge alone could arm him against the horror in that house. That night, well after midnight, Elliot noticed the lantern on the neighbor's porch flickering in a frantic, almost strobe-like rhythm. The faint light flashed on and off outside the windows like lightning striking the house. Gathering all his nerves, Elliot slipped out the door and crossed the street. He didn't even know what he was going to do: confront his neighbor, call for help, or break in. But his feet moved on their own, driven by a terrible curiosity. As he approached the neighbor's porch, the wooden boards groaned under his weight, and for a moment he thought he heard something scraping against the walls. He tried the doorknob. It turned easily and opened. With a shaky breath, Elliot pushed the door open and slipped out into the corridor, his heart pounding so hard he could barely breathe. The smell hit him first, acrid and suffocating, an unholy mixture of rotten incense, sweat, and something coppery. The candles lining the walls cast long, crooked shadows that danced like madmen. What little furniture remained had been pushed aside, revealing a shabby trail of dark, frozen stains leading to a doorway at the end of the corridor. Elliot walked past a half-turned bookshelf, nearly tripping over a tattered leather journal. Reflexively, he grabbed it, shining his flashlight on the pages covered with haphazard scribbles. Most of them were written in an unfamiliar script, but a few lines were in English. It demands sacrifice. It devours dreamers. He stalks me through the shadows. I hear his footsteps in every silence of the night. Each sentence became more and more nonsensical, scribbled as if with a trembling hand. A sudden impact made him drop the diary. The sound echoed off the door at the end of the corridor, followed by a frantic whisper. Summoning up his courage, Elliot stepped closer until he reached the threshold and peered inside. He found himself at the entrance to a large, open space, a living room, stripped of all furniture. The floor was covered with candlelit ritual signs arranged in spirals and mysterious symbols that made his eyes swim if he stared long enough. Against one wall stood his neighbor, bent in worship. His hands were raised to the leaky ceiling, through which a sliver of moonlight was seeping in. Next to him lay a hunched mass that Elliot recognized only after a few seconds as a human figure. The battered body an unknown man or woman looked lifeless, its pale limbs stretched out at an unnatural angle. Elliot felt such a pure jolt of horror that it took his breath away. He had suspected the worst, but seeing a real corpse in that cold circle of runes made his stomach go crazy. He bit down on his fist to suppress his gag reflex, his head spinning with the realization that people were missing, and now he knew exactly where one of them was. The neighbor's voice rose into a booming chant, the words thick with a guttural accent that seemed older than time. His voice echoed through the jagged opening, as if he were calling out to someone from the starless void. And then, with a wind that seemed to come out of nowhere, an impossible shape, made of twisted angles and bones that did not belong to any normal skeleton, descended into the room, or rather, he unfolded, as it were. His head touched the ceiling, and his elongated, expressionless face turned to the corpse lying at his neighbor's feet. Elliot could not take his eyes off him. Some primitive part of his brain was screaming to run, to escape into the night and never look back. But he froze, the flashlight trembling in his hand. He watched as the toreador leaned over the lifeless body. The air was filled with a sucking, squelching sound, and Elliot put his hand over his mouth to keep from screaming. The foul odor blossomed, turning his stomach inside out. The neighbor let out a shaky, victorious sob. "Take it away! Take it away!" he shouted, his voice breaking before his eyes. Tears streamed down his face, and his eyes burned with a fanatical glare. As if in response, the bullfighter straightened up, his body shimmering in the trembling candlelight. Suddenly, he turned his head toward Elliot. His eyes, if he had eyes at all, stared at him with a feeling that penetrated the darkness and boredom of mere mortal thoughts. Elliot felt his presence seeping into his bones, as if he had already claimed him. The expression on the neighbor's face changed from religious ecstasy to anxiety. He hissed through his teeth, "You shouldn't be here." In an instant, he lunged at him. Elliot stumbled, and the flashlight rolled across the floor. A frozen hand clutched at his shirt, pulling him into the circle of runes. Their surface felt slippery and sticky under his boots. Hot candle wax mixed with old blood to form a stinking glue that threatened to trap him in place. Outside, a storm howled, rattling the windows until they shattered. The whole house seemed to shake, as if it was seething with energy. Struggling, Elliot managed to kick his neighbor in the ribs, causing him to stagger backwards, gasping for breath. The momentary respite gave Elliot the opportunity to slip under Tredder's grotesque limbs, his adrenaline pumping with every step. He grabbed a flashlight from the floor. The monster stretched out its arm, its limbs bent in many places, scraping against the wooden boards. Elliot felt the air around him bend and the temperature drop with every unnatural movement of that elongated body. Hurrying on pure instinct, he dashed down the hall, ignoring the agonizing fear that twisted in his gut. Behind him, a deafening roar tore through the night, a sound that no human vocal cords could reproduce. It was as if a chorus of anguished voices were breaking through the torn fabric of the world, echoing with maddening fury. The whole house shook. The flames of the candles trembled and went out, plunging the corridor into darkness. Elliot nearly collided with the front door in his frantic flight. He yanked it open, only to hear another wild scream behind him. Even in the darkness, he could feel the traitor coming closer, the floorboards groaning under its incredible weight. Gathering the last of his strength in his trembling limbs, he dove through the doorway and fell onto the porch. Without pausing, he flew down the stairs and ran outside into the faint light of a single flickering street lamp. Around him, the night was boiling with new anger. Clouds were moving too fast across the sky, and shadows were sliding across the asphalt. He risked one last look at the house. Through the open door, he saw a shuddering silhouette, the bony figure of his neighbor, framed by what loomed behind him. The monster's eyes, or whatever replaced them, burned with an ominous awareness that haunted Elliot like an invisible stigma. Then he ran. He did not stop until he felt his lungs were ready to burst. Only when he reached the far end of the block did he dare to look back. The house was a dim figure on the horizon, the sickly glow of the porch light flickering back and forth like a fading star. In the days that followed, Elliot never showed up at that cul-de-sac again. He packed up his belongings and moved to a squalid apartment in a neighboring state. Nightmares plagued him, echoing with the roar of the treater, haunted by the crooked, devoted smile of his neighbor. Every morning he woke up with the lingering smell of rotten incense in his nostrils, as if terror were stuck in his soul. No official report has ever confirmed what happened on that street. The case of the missing person remained open, unsolved, and the neighbor's house soon became abandoned, though Elliot sometimes saw rumors on the internet, whispered in conspiracy forums, about fresh footprints appearing in the yard every time the moon grew dark. Deep down, he knew that the terror was not limited to this house. It was still out there, slipping out from under the thin veil of normal life. And Elliot realized the ultimate, painful truth. When you see this horror, you carry a piece of it in your mind, an invitation that it can respond to at any moment. Even 1,000 miles away, he could still hear the soft gnashing of claws in his dreams, still see the outstretched limbs in his peripheral vision. There would be no real escape, no peace. The one who is leaving will eventually come for him with quiet, inexorable steps across the barren threshold of reality. And when it does, Elliot knew he would hear those footsteps on his porch, and every sound would be a promise of his inevitable fate.